Today we will be reading Chapter 3, Anne's Apology. When Anne was not doing chores, she explored Green Gables. She made friends with every tree and shrub. She visited the lake of shining waters and danced over the hills and gathered starflowers. She played in the orchard and picked violets in the valley. Anne decorated her little East Gable room with apple blossoms and lilacs. She told Matthew and Marilla every last detail of all of her wanderings. They grew used to her talkative ways, and soon it felt like she'd always been part of life at Green Gables. Now, Mrs. Rachel Lynde, a nosy neighbor, she had been sick. If she had been well, she would have been over right away to meet the orphan. Anne had been at Green Gables for almost 2 weeks before Mrs. Lynde was well enough to come and visit. And when she finally came, Marilla called Anne in from playing. Her freckles were bright from the sunshine, and her red hair was very windblown. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was a woman who said what she thought. She took one look at Anne and said, "Well, you didn't pick her for her looks. That's for sure. She's a skinny little thing, isn't she? Look at those freckles. And hair as red as carrots, too. Come here, child." Anne got terribly angry, and her face turned bright red. She stomped across the room and yelled at Mrs. Lynde. "I hate you," she cried. "How dare you call me skinny and ugly? How dare you say I'm freckled and red-headed? You are a rude woman. How would you like to be called fat and clumsy? I don't care if I hurt your feelings. You have hurt mine, and I'll never forgive you for it. Never, never, never." And Anne stomped her foot in anger. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was shocked. She didn't say a word. She just sat and stared at Anne. "Anne, go to your room at once," said Marilla. Marilla's white face looked very angry. Anne ran up to the east gable. She threw herself onto her bed and cried. Marilla did not know what to say to Mrs. Lynde, and when she spoke, she surprised herself by sticking up for the child. "You shouldn't have teased her about her looks, Rachel. I'm not trying to excuse her. I'll give her a stern talking to about it, but she's never been taught what is right. You were too hard on her, Rachel." "Well," Mrs. Lynde said, "if I were you, I'd do that talking to with a birch stick." She swept out the door, very offended. Marilla found Anne on her bed crying. "Anne, get off that bed this minute and listen to me. How could you lose your temper like that? I was ashamed of you, Anne. Rachel was a stranger and a grown-up and a guest, and you should have been respectful to her for all of these reasons. You were very rude. You must go to apologize to her." "I can't," said Anne. "I cannot ask Mrs. Lynde to forgive me. She only said things about you that you say about yourself," Marilla said. "You've said that you think you're skinny, and you hate your red hair and freckles." "It's different," Anne answered. "When someone else says it, it's just not the same at all." "Just the same, you must say you're sorry," said Marilla, "and you'll stay here in your room until you do." "Well, I'll have to stay here forever then," said Anne. "I'm sorry I upset you, but I can't say I'm sorry when I'm not." "Well, maybe you'll see it differently in the morning," replied Marilla, "because you'll have all night to think it over." In spite of herself, Marilla was a little bit amused as she walked down to the kitchen. Mrs. Rachel had been rude, and she was an old gossip. It was high time someone pointed those facts out to her. Anne stayed in her room the whole next day. Marilla brought up her meals, but wouldn't let Anne come down until she was ready to say she was sorry. Matthew thought it was too quiet downstairs without Anne. Matthew tiptoed up to the East Gable room. He peeped in, walked over to the unhappy girl and whispered, "Anne, don't you think you'd better do it and have it over with? You know, Marilla is a mighty determined woman, Anne. Do it and have it over with." "Do you mean apologize to Mrs. Lynde?" "Yes, apologize. That's the very word," said Matthew. It's terrible lonesome downstairs without you. Just go and smooth it over. But don't tell Marilla that I've said anything about it." "Very well," said Anne. "I would never want to make either of you unhappy." When Marilla came in, she heard Anne calling her from the upstairs hall. "I'm sorry I said rude things," Anne told her. "I'm ready to go and tell Mrs. Lynde too." Marilla took Anne to Mrs. Lynde's house. By the time they got there, Anne had worked up a very special apology. She walked in and got down on her knees at Mrs. Rachel Lynde's feet. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so very sorry. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper because you told me the truth. You were right. My hair is red, and I'm freckled and skinny. What I said to you was true too, but I shouldn't have said it. Please, please forgive me. If you won't, it will break the heart of a poor orphan girl. You wouldn't want to do that, would you?" Mrs. Lynde was impressed by this emotional speech. She forgave Anne, and they promised to be friends from then on. And on the way home, Anne told Marilla that she wouldn't get so angry if people didn't tease her about her red hair. She was so tired of being teased. "But it does give you a lovely feeling to say you're sorry and be forgiven, doesn't it?" asked Anne. She slipped her hand into Marilla's and told her how happy she was to live at Green Gables. It was the first real home she ever had.